All right, so we get into chapter 9 of The Big Short. It's titled The Death of Interest. I'll get into that title name in just a second. But we meet a new character in the book. His name's Howie Hubler, and he is a football player. He's a pretty big guy, and he's working at Morgan Stanley. And his job is basically to manage, like, be the head of all the mortgage-backed securities and all those bonds. And so he begins to, get pretty into this business as the mortgage market is starting to soar in the U.S., starting to hit a boom. But he does decide to get into these things called credit default swaps, which we already know what they are in the book. And they're just really to cover his position because he doesn't really know if they can go sour on him or not. So he decides to cover his position a little bit with the credit default swaps. And he basically splits up into his own little thing. But he works on a floor. I think it's like a 10th floor, and then Morgan Stanley's main thing is on the second floor or whatever. So, like, they're still the same thing, but he's kind of separated a bit, and he has his own team. He hires the geniuses of Morgan Stanley to help him do this, and they start betting against the market a little bit. But Morgan Stanley doesn't really like what he's doing, so they make him sell a little bit of it, as well as he doesn't really know what he's doing. Unfortunately, Hubler believes he's betting against the market, but in reality, the credit default swaps he did were like not very good, so he's actually losing money. And so when the market started to really, bust a little bit in like 2007, he gets a call from Greta Lippmann saying, "Hey man, you owe me $1.2 billion of this stuff, man. Like you gotta pay up." And Morgan Stanley like, there's no way. Look at our models. We're making money. We should be reaping the profits of our mortgage-backed securities. And Lipman's like, "No, you're wrong. Your model's fake. It's stupid. You owe me money. Hey, I'll cut you a deal right now. We'll get it at a less price, and that way you don't have to lose as much." And Morgan Stanley still doesn't. They refuse to believe it. So then Lipman's like, "Okay." Calls 2 weeks later. It's like, "Now you owe me more money. Like you got to pay up." And so Morgan Stanley like can't believe it. They refuse, but they start to realize that maybe it is true. So they end up like kind of firing Hubler in a way by sending him on this vacation that he never comes back from, and so he lives in kind of in isolation at this point. And basically this is like when the mortgage-backed securities market starts failing on everyone, and a lot of these big Wall Street firms that were pretty heavily invested in a lot of these CDOs are starting to lose their money because a lot of the people who had the credit default swaps are starting to claim it and say, "Hey, you guys got to pay up," and they didn't have the capital to pay up. So one of the people that we looked at in earlier chapters, Cornwall Capital, was pretty heavily invested in betting against these people. They had a lot of credit default swaps, but they bought them all from Bear Stearns. And one of their fears was that if Bear Stearns failed, if they went bankrupt, even if they were right on the bet, no one was going to pay them back because Bear Stearns was going to be obviously insolvent. So what was going to happen is they were going to have to sell their credit default swap somehow. Someone had to buy them. That way they could assure that even if Bear Stearns failed, that they would have made a profit, that they didn't lose even though they were right. So they're trying to find a buyer, excuse me. And one of the people they had, remember they met him in Vegas, his name is Ben, I think. He basically is in vacation with his family in England, I believe, and he's at a tavern, and he's starting to make all these deals. They're trying to find some sort of buyer. At first, the Wall Street firms are like really hesitant to even get into this trade, but he does find a buyer in UBS, I believe, and he sells them a bunch of their credit default swaps that were bought from Bear Stearns, essentially wiping their hands clean in case that Bear Stearns somehow failed, even though a lot of these Wall Street firms decided to take this trade because they didn't think Bear Stearns was capable of failing. They thought it was too big to fail, no way that it was going to fail, so they thought that this could be a good way to kind of give them a cushion on these losses they were going to take because they were so bullish on the mortgage-backed securities market. So basically, we see Cornwall win out. They make a huge profit. They started with like $100,000 in a Schwab account. They end up in the millions of dollars. So they ended up winning on this bet. Burry, same thing happens with him. Remember, we talked about him in the last chapter. He basically claims his winnings as well, and he wants some of his investors that were doubting him out, right? Because a lot of his investors, when they were down in the market, they were calling him, they were angry at him, they wanted to pull their money out. So once he makes the money on the credit default swaps, he's like, "Okay, you guys can leave my company. I don't want to see you ever again for doubting me." And we learn at the end that Burry is kind of losing this obsession for the finance because the way he made money was not fun for him. He was making money for the people, but they never thanked him. They were only angry at him when they were losing. So he decides to basically kind of step back from finance a little bit, and we learn at the end that he buys this guitar and he starts to get pretty obsessed with it. Even though he doesn't even know how to play the guitar, he just starts to get a new interest, and he talks about how his Asperger's might help him, really get interested in this whole guitar thing. So that's where the chapter ends up. That's the death of interest really gives Mike Burry's interest in the financial markets, because he wasn't passionate about earning money anymore because it wasn't satisfying to him. People weren't thanking him and stuff like that. So that's pretty much how the chapter ends up. Pretty interesting. The people who were on the short side of the mortgage market ended up winning out. The Wall Street firms ended up taking huge losses. And yeah, that's pretty much how the cookie crumbles.